Chapter 27. Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. Instead of receiving any such letter of excuse from his friend, as Elizabeth half expected Mr. Bingley to do, he was able to bring Darcy with him to Longbourn before many days had passed. The gentleman arrived early, and Bingley suggested that they all go for a walk. Mrs. Bennet was not in the habit of walking, and Mary could never give up the time, but the remaining 5 set out together. Bingley and Jane, though, soon allowed the others to get ahead of them, and Elizabeth, Kitty, and Darcy were left to entertain each other. Kitty wanted to call on the Lucases, and when she left the other 2, Elizabeth went on bravely with Darcy alone. She had secretly been making a difficult decision, and perhaps he had been doing the same. Now was the moment to put hers into action, so she said, "Mr. Darcy, I am a very selfish creature, and in order to give relief to my own feelings, do not care how much I may be wounding yours. I can no longer help thanking you for your deep kindness to my poor sister." "I am sorry," replied Darcy, in a voice full of surprise and feeling, "that you have ever been informed of what may, by mistake, have given you discomfort of mind." "Do not blame my aunt. Lydia's thoughtlessness first caused the truth to be known, and I could not rest until I knew the details. Let me thank you again in the name of all my family." "If you will thank me," he replied, "let it be for yourself alone. Your family owe me nothing. Much as I respect them, I believe that I thought only of you." Elizabeth was too confused to say a word. After a short pause, her companion added, "You are too generous to keep me in uncertainty. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My love and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever." Elizabeth now forced herself to speak, and made him understand that her feelings had changed so completely since that period that she was grateful and pleased to hear his present words. The happiness that this reply produced was greater than he had probably ever experienced before, and he expressed himself on the occasion as warmly as a man who is violently in love can be expected to do. They walked on without knowing in what direction. There was too much to be thought and felt and said for attention to anything else. She soon learned that they owed their present good understanding to the efforts of his aunt, who did call on him to describe her conversation with Elizabeth, but with the opposite effect to that which she intended. "It taught me to hope," he said, "as I had hardly allowed myself to hope before. I knew enough of your character to be certain that if you had been completely decided against me, you would have admitted it to Lady Catherine openly." Elizabeth laughed as she replied, "Yes, you knew enough of my readiness to speak plainly to believe that I was able to do that. After criticizing you so shamefully to your face, I could have no fear of criticizing you to your relations." "What did you say of me that I did not deserve?" "For though your charges were mistaken, my behavior to you then was unpardonable. I have been selfish all my life. Unfortunately, I was spoiled by my parents, who, though good themselves, encouraged me to be proud and to think with scorn of the rest of the world. That is how I was, and how I might still be, if I had not met you. Dearest Elizabeth, you taught me a lesson, a hard one, but most advantageous. You showed me how small were all my claims to please a woman who deserved to be pleased. I am almost afraid to ask what you thought of me when we met at Pemberley. Did you blame me for coming? No, no, I felt nothing but surprise. I admit that I did not expect to be so well received. My aim, then, replied Darcy, was to show you by every attention that I had no bad feelings for you, and I hoped to obtain your forgiveness and lessen your bad opinion of me by letting you see that I was trying to cure my faults. After walking several miles in an unhurried manner, they examined their watches and found that it was time to be at home. Wherever were Mr. Bingley and Jane? This thought introduced a discussion of their affairs. Darcy was very happy that they had become engaged. I must ask you whether you were surprised, said Elizabeth. Not at all. When I went away, I felt it would happen. That is to say, you had given your permission. And though he refused to say so, she found that it was very much the case. I told him before I left that I thought that I had given him mistaken advice, and that I had been at fault in supposing your sister did not care for him. Did you speak from what you had seen yourself, or only from my information last spring? From the former. I watched your sister closely during the 2 visits which I recently made here, and I felt sure of her love for Bingley. Elizabeth would have liked to remark that Mr. Bingley was a most satisfactory friend, so easily guided, but she controlled herself. She remembered that Darcy still had to learn to be laughed at, and it was rather early to begin. They continued in conversation until they reached the house and parted in the hall. My dear Lizzy, where have you been walking to? Was the question which Elizabeth received from Jane as soon as she entered the room, and from all the others when they sat down to table. She had only to say that they had wandered about until they had lost their way. Her face turned slightly red as she spoke, but nobody suspected the truth. The evening passed quietly. It was not in Darcy's nature to express happiness through high spirits, and Elizabeth was thinking of what her family would feel when everything was known. At night, she opened her heart to Jane. You are joking, Lizzy? Engaged to Mr. Darcy? No, no, you shall not deceive me. I know that it is impossible, but it's true. I am serious. I speak nothing but the truth. Oh, Lizzy, I know how much you dislike him. That is all forgotten. Perhaps I did not always love him as well as I do now. No, but are you certain, forgive the question, are you quite certain that you can be happy with him? There can be no doubt of that. But are you pleased, Jane? Very, very much. Nothing could give Bingley or myself greater pleasure. Oh, Lizzy, are you sure that you feel what you ought to feel? I am only afraid you will think that I feel more than I ought when I tell you all. What do you mean? Well, I must admit that I love him better than I do Bingley. I am afraid that you will be angry. My dearest sister, be serious. Will you tell me how long you have loved him? I believe that I must date it from my first seeing his beautiful grounds at Pemberley. Another request. that she should be serious produced the desired effect, and she soon made Jane believe in her sincerity. Elizabeth told the reasons for her former secrecy, her unsettled feelings, and her unwillingness to mention Bingley, which she could hardly have avoided doing if she had spoken of the meeting in Derbyshire. Half the night was spent in conversation. "Oh, heavens!" cried Mrs. Bennet, as she stood at the window the next morning. "That disagreeable Mr. Darcy is coming here again with our dear Bingley. What can he mean by being so annoying? Lizzy, you must walk out with him again, so that he will not be in Bingley's way." Elizabeth could hardly help laughing at so convenient a proposal, but she was really annoyed that her mother should be speaking of him in such a manner. As soon as they entered, Bingley looked at her so expressively, and shook hands with such warmth, that she was in no doubt of his knowledge, and he soon afterwards said, "Mrs. Bennet, have you no more country roads round about here, in which Lizzy may lose her way again today?" "I advise Mr. Darcy and Lizzy and Kitty," said Mrs. Bennet, "to walk to Oakham Mount this morning. It is a nice long walk, and Mr. Darcy has never seen the view." "I'm sure that it would be too much for Kitty," said Bingley. Kitty admitted that she would rather stay at home. As Elizabeth went upstairs, her mother followed her, saying, "I am sorry, Lizzy, that you should be forced to have that disagreeable man all to yourself. But it is all for Jane, you know. There is no need to talk to him, except just now and then, so do not put yourself to inconvenience." During the walk, it was decided that Mr. Bennet's agreement to the marriage should be asked during the evening. Elizabeth kept for herself the duty of asking her mother's. In the evening, soon after Mr. Bennet had gone to his library, Mr. Darcy followed him. Elizabeth's anxiety was extreme. She did not fear her father's opposition, but that she should be making him unhappy by her choice was a troubling thought. She was a little relieved by Darcy's smile on his return, when he whispered to her, "Go to your father." She went directly. Her father was walking about the room, looking serious. "Lizzy," he said, "what are you doing? Are you out of your mind to be accepting this man? Have you not always hated him?" How deeply she then wished that her former opinions had been more reasonable, and her expression of them less extreme. It would have saved her explanations that it was very awkward to give. She told him, in some confusion, of the strength of her feelings for Mr. Darcy. "That is to say, you are determined to have him? He is rich, to be sure, and you may have more fine clothes and fine carriages than Jane, but will they make you happy? We all know him to be a proud, unpleasant man." I do like him," she replied, with tears in her eyes. "And what you say of him is untrue. You do not know what it really is." "Lizzy," said her father, "I have agreed, but let me advise you to think better of it. I know your nature, Lizzy. I know that you could not be happy unless you truly respected your husband. My child, do not let me have the unhappiness of seeing you unable to think well of your partner in life." At last, by repeating that Mr. Darcy was really the object of her choice, by explaining the gradual change in her feelings and her proof of the unchanging nature of his, and describing with energy all his good qualities. She did persuade her father to believe her and make him satisfied with her choice. To complete his favourable opinion, she then told him what Mr. Darcy had done for Lydia. "Well, my dear," he said when she had finished speaking, "if this is the case, he deserves you. I could not have parted with you, my Lizzy, to anyone who did not." He then reminded her of her confusion a few days before when he was reading Mr. Collins's letter, and after laughing at her, allowed her to go, saying as she left the room, "If any young men come for Mary or Kitty, send them in. I am not busy." Elizabeth's mind was now relieved of a very heavy weight, and after half an hour's quiet thought in her own room, she was able to join the others in fairly settled spirits. When her mother went up to her dressing room at night, she followed her and made the important announcement. Its effect was most astonishing. When she heard it, Mrs. Bennet sat quite still, unable to say a word. Only after many, many minutes could she understand what she had heard. She began at last to recover, to move about in a chair, get up, sit down again, and every now and then let out a small laugh. "Oh, heavens, Lord, save me! Only think, Mr. Darcy! Who would have thought it? Oh, my sweetest, sweetest Lizzy, how rich and great you will be! What jewels, what carriages you will have! James is nothing to it, nothing at all. Such a pleasant man, so good-looking, so tall. Oh, my dear Lizzy, do apologize for my having disliked him so much before. Dear Lizzy, a house in town, 3 daughters married, 10,000 a year. Oh, heavens, what will happen to me? I shall go out of my mind." This was an unpleasing example of what her mother's behaviour might be like in the presence of Mr. Darcy. But the next day passed off better than Elizabeth expected. Luckily, Mrs. Bennet was so filled with respect for her intended son-in-law that she did not dare to speak to him except to offer him some mark of attention. Elizabeth had the satisfaction of seeing her father making every effort to know him better, and Mr. Bennet soon informed her that Mr. Darcy was rising in his opinion every hour.